you, Senator Muir. Senator Canavan.
Thank you, Madam Acting Deputy President. Before I start my speech, it's good to see Minister Nash here in the chamber, because Minister Nash often thinks that I'm a little bit of a nerd at times, particularly sitting down here in the National Party. She probably thinks I've spent more time with a protractor than a set of pliers in my time. And I'm going to talk about something a little bit nerdy. I'm going to confirm to Minister Nash that, in fact, I've been a bit of a nerd for some time, because the very first speech I can remember making in public was in 1992, and I was 12 years old, and I was competing in the Lions Youth Club of the Year award in Beenleigh, and I chose a topic for my speech at the time of the threat of an ageing population to Australia. It's a pretty nerdy topic for a 12-year-old. I'll be very proud if my son in 2 years' time does the same. But I was talking about it then, and I'm going to talk about it now as well. 22 years, 23 years now down the track. Back then, I don't have a copy of the speech I gave. I can't remember what figures I quoted or what I relied on, but it was certainly a topical issue still at that time. We knew it was a threat coming, that we had a population that was ageing. That was going to mean that certain costs were going to be imposed on our particularly our public sector, and it was going to be a threat to our fiscal sustainability as a nation. About 10 years after that, I found myself, I was a graduate at the Productivity Commission, and they did a report while I was there on the costs of an ageing population. And they found that if we did nothing in the next 40 or 50 years back then, we would end up with a debt of more than $4 trillion and a debt to GDP ratio approaching 200%. Now, we've had other intergenerational reports as well during that time, and we're about to have another one released tomorrow. And I don't have any, of course, knowledge about that, but I do want to continue to hammer on about what I think is the greatest challenge facing our nation right now. And that's the fact that at the moment we are struggling to have our revenue match our expenses. It's the greatest challenge for most households in this country. I'm fortunate enough at the moment, I'm fine, I've got enough money, but certainly when I was starting out after uni, it was the greatest challenge my wife and I faced, having kids and balancing our budget, making sure the rent and mortgage we paid matched up with the money I got every couple of weeks in my paycheck. But we're not doing that as a nation. We're not doing that as a House here in Canberra. This Parliament House is failing to do that, and we've been consistently failing to do that now for years. And I went back and just had a look at the historical tables in the budget papers. You can go and get those. These figures aren't actually my EFO. These are last year's budget papers, so they've actually gotten slightly worse, but they're in the order. We had two recessions in the last 30 years. We haven't had a recession for 25 years this year. That's a pretty amazing outcome. It's actually the second longest period in world history. In the first recession we had in that time period in the early 1980s, we ran 5 years of deficits, and they totalled a cumulative amount of 10.5% of GDP. In the second recession we had, the recession we had to have in the early 1990s, we ran 7 years of deficits, and they added up to 17.2% of GDP. And we've had a downturn. We haven't had a recession, but we had an economic downturn as a result of the global financial crisis. And we are on track right now. We're on track to run, under the current projections, 10 years of deficits in a row. And that's just on the projections. There could possibly even be more beyond that unless we take action. But 10 deficits in a row baked in the cake, and they would add up to a total cumulative deficit of 20.5% of GDP. Now, we haven't had a recession in the last few years. Our economic growth in the last decade has been just below trend, and we have racked up a fifth of our GDP in debt. Now, that has left us in a much more vulnerable, or will leave us soon, in a much more vulnerable position to face the challenges we face because of this ageing population, because we're going to have fewer workers per dependence. That ratio is going to drop down to the low sort of ones. We'll have about 1.2 to 1.4 people aged in the working population to support both the elderly and the youth, anyone below 15. Now, as I said, the new figures will come out tomorrow, but we already have some figures pretty recently that show the scale of the task. Last year, late 2013, the Productivity Commission released an update on that ageing Australian report, ageing population report, and they found they had a look at what was the difference between our revenues and expenses over the next 50 years through to 2060, based on some pretty conservative assumptions, I thought. And that gap, that fiscal gap, would add up to $3.1 trillion in that period. Now, that's just a raw gap each year. We'd have to find $3.1 trillion to 2060. That's in today's dollars. All these figures are in today's dollars. Of course, we'd have to borrow to fund that gap, and we'd have to borrow at a positive interest rate to fund that gap. So the debt would actually grow to something above $7 trillion by 2060. Now, that would be 1.5 times our GDP. That would put us in the league of Japan and Greece at the moment, and other nations that are in great fiscal difficulty. Now, we don't have a reason to panic. There is no reason to get despondent about this, because we have time to fix it. We have time to fix it. But even though we have time, I just want to draw one comparison which I think is instructive. We often here in this place just talk about Commonwealth debt, but I'm a senator for Queensland, and we also have $80 billion of debt there in Queensland. And there are 4.5 million Queenslanders or thereabouts, so $80 billion in debt translates to around $17,000 per person. Here in Australia, at the Commonwealth level, we have about, I haven't checked last week, but last week we had $356 billion in debt. We have 23 odd million people. That translates to about $16,000 per person. That adds up, if you're a Queenslander, you owe both the state and federal governments, on average, around $33,000 a person right now. Now, if you look at Greece, right now in Greece, they owe a gross debt of 328 billion euros. They have 11 million people. Their gross debt is 30,000 euros per person. In Australian dollars terms, it's about $43,000 per person. It's only $10,000 per person more than the Queenslander owes right now. Now, there's a big difference between Australia and Greece, I accept that. We're not in the Greece situation. But what's the difference? It's not that absolute debt numbers, because there's not much difference there. The difference is we have a strong economy. The difference is we create economic wealth per person around 50 to 60% higher than Greece, so we can afford to carry more debt. The difference is that people are still buying our exports at the moment. But those things might change. As I said, we haven't had a recession for nearly 25 years. For nearly a quarter of a century. My generation in the workforce does not understand what a recession is like. If we were to have one, we may not have the wealth to sustain the kind of things and spending initiatives we expect now in the next decade. We must change. We must change. Now, there are some out there that I think, and I heard in estimates last week, that, all these figures are based on assumptions about the net overseas migration. It doesn't matter because we're going to have assumptions in this report tomorrow that make that difference. Well, that is rubbish. That is rubbish. Over these years, over the intergenerational reports, the different Productivity Commission reports, they've had different assumptions about net overseas migration, and they make very little difference to the end result. They make very little difference. At the end result is we are fiscally dead, and it doesn't matter how dead you are, you're still dead. And I asked the Treasury about this last week at estimates about would there be a difference if we had some different demographic assumptions, and they said, Mr Harris at estimates last week said, we have done our own assessment of what we think would be a likely level of migration, but whether it could ever offset an ageing demographic situation of the kind we face is a reasonably improbable prospect. That's about as strong language you're going to get from a Treasury official. But that is not our problem. And similarly, our problem is not our taxes, because the fiscal gap in 40 or 50 years' time will be about 4% of GDP. It will be bigger than our deficit right now. Right now, that equates to around $70 billion, 4% of our GDP. That's the gap we've got to fund every year. And there are some out there would say that all we need to do is tax multinational companies and corporates and we'll be able to fill that gap. Well, we won't, because right now our company tax only collects around $70 billion a year. So we have to double our company tax, and we're not going to do that from a few multinationals. We have to, as a nation, get serious about this problem. We have an obligation here, right now, not to kick the can down the road like we have the last 10 years, because if we do that, in the next 10 years, we will face a serious threat. We will face a serious crisis. I don't know if I'll still be here in 10 years' time, but I sure hope that I won't have spent 10 years in this place continuing to argue about this issue, not having it resolved, and we've created a much more difficult problem for our future generations.